I'm Don Carter, and welcome to the Don Carter World Report. Well, today we really have a person who is going to be most interesting. We have Дэвид Irving. And Дэвид Irving is a British historian and author of remarkable talent. This is his book, and he is in Calgary at the present moment to chat about Churchill's war. And so we're going to devote most of this program to this particular book and Churchill's war. And those people who were in the Second World War might get a rather unpleasant shock, and they also might have some very pleasant memories. But anyway, I'd like to welcome Дэвид Irving. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to hearing from you.
I'm looking forward to talking to you.
My goodness me, how is it you've always written exclusively about, you know, Germany's war and wartime leaders?
Many years ago, I was a student in London and growing up, and between two periods of going to university, I went and worked in Germany as a steel worker, actually working on the furnace stage in Germany to learn the language. And this gave me an insight into the war years by talking to the Germans on the other side, which I had not had as an Englishman, which I gathered a lot of Englishmen hadn't had either. For example, one of my fellow workers in the steelworks had been in the town of Dresden at the time that we British bombed it.
Oh, you wrote a book on that, I believe.
Indeed, I then wrote this book because he told me that in that space of 3 hours we killed about 250,000 people, which I found out to be true when I then carried out the research into that raid. And I wrote a book about it, and it became a bestseller. And I've decided there and then to become a writer for the rest of my life.
Well, you've been tremendously successful, I must say. Well, did you have any problems after writing Hitler's War in 1977?
Well, after writing the Dresden book, I then spent 10 years writing a biography of Hitler using the same techniques. In other words, not reading other books, just going to the archives and speaking with Hitler's private staff, his secretaries, the colonels, the field marshals, getting hold of their private diaries and letters. And
fascinating.
The result was such an unusual view of Hitler, almost the war seen through his eyes, that it upset a lot of people who had been taught the war history differently. They wanted the old version of history to remain, and they didn't like it when in 1977 my new look at Hitler came along, Hitler's War. It was published by the world's most reputable publishers, but from that moment on, as a journalist in Time magazine told me a few months ago, having gone through his own press clippings library, from that moment on I've had buckets of slime poured on me. He said until Hitler's War was published, I was the darling of the media. Every book that I'd written got whole-page reviews in Time and Newsweek and the other newspapers. From 1977, with the publication of the Hitler biography, suddenly I was unspeakable. My books were subjected to the most vicious attack. I personally was subjected to attack. My front door was smashed in by gentlemen with sledgehammers. Printing works was burned to the ground because it had printed things that I had written. I had people visiting me disguised as telephone engineers who ransacked my home, this kind of thing.
Good heavens, it sounds like 1989 and our friend with the satanic verses, doesn't it?
Well, I haven't had a price put on my head, but it's the same kind of thing. You're subjected to a kind of intellectual terror.
Well, you must be a very strong person. What, you're married?
I'm married with 4 children, 4 daughters.
Good. So do they worry about this at all, or are they very supportive?
Well, I remember on the first occasion when we found our home being ransacked by gentlemen disguised as British post office engineers. In fact, they were members of a Jewish underground group. We caught the lot. They all went to prison for it. That my wife, our first baby had just been born, and she was terrified by this kind of thing.
Yes, it would be.
And I've had that kind of problem for the next 25 years. That I've had death threats, bomb threats. I spoke at the University of Berkeley 3 or 4 days ago, and the attempts made by the opposition to get the University of California to ban my appearance at Berkeley were extraordinary. They're just terrified of my version of the history being put to the reading public.
But in your own particular view, I mean, this is a silly question, but I have to bring it out. You are quite sure that your facts that you've written about are, to your own mind, absolutely straight on, smack on, and correct?
I may be wrong, but then it is up to the other side to stand up and debate me. I can take an example. The biography of Winston Churchill, which I published 2 years ago, in 1987, I challenged Martin Gilbert, the authorized Churchill biographer, who in private says vicious things about me and my books. I challenged him to appear on television programs. Television companies contacted him and said, Mr. Gilbert, we want to do a face-to-face interview between you and Mr. Irving where he can challenge your book and you can challenge his. And on every single occasion, Martin Gilbert has ducked out of any kind of debate.
What a pity. That would be a marvellous debate, wouldn't it?
I think it's very sad because Martin Gilbert is quite a clever man.
Yeah.
But as Churchill's authorized biographer, he obviously labors under severe burdens. He has to write things that are satisfactory to the Churchill family. But his books are also riddled with errors and riddled with misconceptions, and he has, in my mind, deliberately distorted history.
Well, that's terrible when you think about it, because I suppose in this day and age, we sort of implicitly trust people, don't we, who write books.
Well,
we even trust journalists, which rather upsets me at times, but anything they see in print, they sort of believe.
The very sad thing is that all the Churchill private papers are closed. You can't read them. Although in Britain we've got a 30-year rule on papers, you're supposed to see anything that's over 30 years old. The Churchill family has somehow managed to keep all the Churchill official papers and private papers secret, and the only person allowed access to them was this historian that they themselves had selected.
So it's very selective himself.
So it's been a hell of a job writing a Churchill biography. In fact, I then had to say to myself, well, every time Churchill wrote a letter, he kept a carbon copy, but the letter went to Eisenhower or Stalin or Roosevelt, and if I go to those libraries of Roosevelt's papers or Stalin's papers, then I will find the letter that Churchill wrote. So I've had to encircle the Churchill family archives in this kind of Stalingrad-like way.
You must be travelling like crazy. And
well, I've researched the Churchill book in the archives of Ottawa, of course, Public Archives of Canada, Canberra, Australia, Paris, Prague, Moscow. I've used Russian, I've used Israeli archives, and I wrote a book about Churchill, the likes of which the world has never seen. We find out, for example, where Churchill got his money in the 1930s, how he managed to stay afloat, who was backing him.
That Baruch?
Not oddly enough, Bernard Baruch. Bernard Baruch's papers, Baruch was this super wealthy American financier, a friend of his, and his private papers are now at the University of Princeton in New Jersey. And I used Baruch's papers, and there's only one letter between the two of them dealing with money, and this is Baruch writing a letter to Churchill saying, Dear Winston, you won't forget that $10 that I loaned you. And Winston sending back the money by return of post, and it's attention to detail like that makes rich men what they are, of course.
Well,
very rich indeed.
Very rich, yeah. Where did he get his money then?
Baruch, or Churchill. Churchill,
yeah.
In the early 1930s, Churchill was out of office. He had no cabinet rank. He was just a member of Parliament. He had a salary of £500 a year. Not bad, but not enough to keep his style of life going.
No, especially that lovely place in Westerham.
He had a beautiful house called Chartwell. He had something like 40 servants, gardeners, servants, secretaries, nannies, the rest of them. And he had only the income of £500 a year. So how did he do it? Initially, he began writing books. He wrote War and Peace, he wrote Crime and Punishment, he wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, he wrote all these famous works of art, which you think you've heard of before, of course.
Yes, of course.
He rewrote them in 25 pages of typescript each for an American newspaper chain. In other words, the idea was, Dear Winston, please rewrite War and Peace so it will fit into one page of a newspaper.
Reader's Digest style sort of thing.
A digest of a digest. And they paid him $1,000 a time for doing that. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, Winston Churchill was not out there campaigning and writing speeches attacking Hitler and Nazism. He was writing Jane Eyre, a lady's novel.
Isn't that incredible?
And then in 1936, when his money was really beginning to run out, he was approached by the Jewish Board of Deputies in Britain, who eventually put up a fund of £50,000 for him to fund a secret group called The Focus.
Oh, I've heard of The Focus. Yeah.
You're one of the very few, because very, very few people have heard of this secret, clandestine conspiracy, this group surrounding Churchill of members of Parliament, millionaires, industrialists, who existed for the sole purpose of getting Winston Churchill back into power. And the idea was that they were funding him so long as he would turn his guns on Hitler. And this was the deal. You attack Hitler with your magnificent rhetoric and oratory and writing powers, and we will finance you. And Churchill was financed for the next 2 or 3 years by The Focus. In 1938, there's a lot of evidence in the German archives and the Czech archives that the Czech government was paying Churchill. Telephone conversations intercepted by the Germans that were going between the Czech ambassador in London and the Czech government, where Jan Masaryk, the Czech ambassador, said Winston Churchill is asking for more, and so is Attlee, the Labour minister, and President Beneš, the Czech president, saying, that's all right, we will send the money to you. When the Munich crisis came, of course, this whole plan collapsed. There was no further future for Beneš. And one of Churchill's gang, one of the Focus members of Parliament, his wife wrote in his diary, poor Edward, her husband, Edward Spears, in fact, one of Churchill's friends, there's going to be a general election now, he'll probably lose his seat in the House of Commons and the £2,000 a year that he gets from the Czech government.
Good.
What an extraordinary thing. Conservative members of Parliament being bribed by the Czechs.
Yes, it's rather. Good gracious me. Anyway, you must have had some trouble in publishing Churchill's War. Could you tell us something? A friend of mine told me that you had to deliver the books by hand in London, England.
Well, this I think is very shameful. I think, of course, the Salman Rushdie thing is shameful in a way. It's censorship of free speech. I think it's shameful when people go around threatening to bomb halls where I speak, but this is even more shameful because I'm dealing with civilized editors and publishers. My books are now published in Britain by Macmillan, which is the family publishing house of the Macmillan family. And they publish all my books, and they're now publishing a new book on Hermann Goering, and they have contracted a book on Roosevelt's war. But when the Churchill book came out, the editors of the Macmillan publishing house said, this is a magnificent book, we want to publish it, and they were overruled by the chairman of the board, who was Harold Macmillan. Harold Macmillan said, this book will be published over my dead body. He, of course, was the successor of Churchill's. He was a member of Churchill's cabinet. I waited until he died. Went back with the manuscript to the Macmillan Publishing House and said, how about it now? And they still refused to publish it. Apparently Macmillan continued to rule from beyond the grave. So I took the manuscript down to Australia and had it published by a tiny publishing house outside Perth, in the desert, who had only published little books about Aboriginal land rights before.
They must be very happy.
Well, the book was the literally number one top bestseller for 2 weeks in Australia. Within 2 weeks of our beating Spycatcher, beating all the other books, right across Australia. And it very nearly bankrupted this little publishing house because there are huge publishing problems when suddenly you're landed with problems of publishing 20,000, 30,000 copies of a book this size.
Well, do you expect any problems with the Roosevelt's war? I mean to say...
the biggest problem
is... That's very controversial, I would think.
I've got a very good German publisher for it. I've got a very good English publisher for it, Macmillan's. I've got good publishers in Italy and France and the other countries except America.
Except
the
America.
United States are saying, oh God, David Irving writing about our beloved President Roosevelt. No, no. So I'm going to have great difficulties getting that book published in the United States. Although here again, I've done the work. I've got the private diaries of Roosevelt's cabinet ministers, which reveal, among other things, that he was viciously anti-Semitic. In private, his remarks about the Jews are so vicious that if I was to make them in Germany, for example, I would be locked up and put away.
I have heard this before, yes. So this is... you know, it's sometimes so distressing, isn't it? As a young man, I remember Churchill, Roosevelt, Smuts, all these wonderful people, and here I was going to war, and these were the leaders behind us.
Yes.
And then 40 years later, you find out exactly what they were like, and it sort of shatters a dream somewhat, doesn't it?
The anti-Semitism is very interesting. I mean, Anthony Eden, for example, was anti-Semitic.
I understood that, yes.
You find their remarks in the archives now, things that they've written in the margins of documents that are real eyebrow raisers, or their private letters, Lord Beaverbrook's letters, for example, which are in the House of Lords Record Office in London, also portray an extraordinary anti-Semitism. And it's rather ironic now, of course, that anti-Semitism has gone out of fashion. And because Adolf Hitler did it in a big way, and so nobody likes to be it anymore.
No. Well, you say you've written a book on Hermann Goring now.
Yes.
What's in that book? He's a fascinating character.
This book took about 5 years to write. Fortunately, I was able, by looking around, to find a lot of the diaries of Hermann Goring. He wrote a lot of diaries both before the war and as a child and during the war. Sometimes he wrote, in fact, 20 diaries simultaneously on different topics. His hunting exploits, the business conferences, his art and opera-loving activities, and running the German Air Force and so on. He was a man of many hats. And I found a lot of these diaries scattered around in private hands in the United States, because the Americans, soldiers, just looted his special trade at the end of the war, stole all his private jewelry, and I mean, he had a lot of jewelry.
I imagine, but what did they do with it? I mean, did they all went into the private hands, or did the government just take it all?
They all went into private hands. The Americans were into looting in a big way at the end of the war.
Did they?
A lot of famous works of art vanished and occasionally turn up now in the auction houses in New York. But the Goering diaries were a main source of my information for the Goering biography, which is being published in the United States this month. And I was very, very fortunate in getting documents from the beginning of Goering's life right up to the very moment when he somehow managed to commit suicide, swallowing poison in his cell at Nuremberg 1 hour before he was about to be hanged. And I got hold of the actual letters that were clutched in his hand when his body was found. The letters that he had written, letters full of sarcasm and wit and triumph, that he had cheated the Americans. He had said he wrote in one letter, well, today you intended to have this big circus, this big spectacle. You were going to be hanging the lot of us with the newsreel cameras and the newspaper men, and you were going to make a spectacle of us there, an indecent, sordid act. well, as the Germans say, ohne mich, without me. Carry on without me because I won't be there. Goodbye.
Good gracious, isn't it?
And the American, the four powers ordered that these letters would never to be published, but I managed to get hold of them from the Allied authorities in Berlin, where they're still held, and I published them in this book on Hermann Gering.
How fascinating. When we're talking about the Air Force, and I go back to Rudolf Hess. Yeah. And Rudolf Hess, I understand, came to England and he was going to talk about peace or something.
Yes.
But the thing that...
Well, you know, I've written a book about Hess.
Yes, so I understand. This is why I want to bring this up, because I understand that there was a lieutenant colonel in the British Marines who's been under house arrest since that time until he died quite recently. And I had the name of the man and everything else, but this is what I heard, and I just wonder whether you had heard anything about this.
I think it's possible. There's a lot that we don't know about the Rudolf Hess case, because a lot of the British documents on Rudolf Hess are not in the archives, and in the archives catalogues it just says these files are withheld until the 21st century. And I get a feeling about some of the archives. I can say, well, this file is probably withheld because it contains medical details. And I can say this file is probably withheld because it concerns a court-martial action against one of the Scottish officers who arrested Hess when he first parachuted into Scotland, and he was wearing improper dress. And he treated Hess very roughly, and for this reason he was court-martialed, and under British public record law, court-martial files are closed for 100 years. But I think probably there are other files which are withheld. For example, Rudolf Hess was held as a prisoner of Mr. Churchill and as a prisoner of the British Secret Service in a specially equipped country mansion south of London for the first year of his stay in Britain. And during that time, he was accompanied everywhere by two companions. And the two companions were apparently English, but they weren't. In fact, they were Germans. German emigres who had become English and spoke fluent German, and their job was to squeeze out of Rudolf Hess, who was Hitler's deputy, every possible secret that he might have in friendly conversation. And sometimes we used truth drugs on him, with the result that eventually Rudolf Hess turned into a vegetable, because truth drugs in those years were very primitive. And the transcripts of the conversations between Hess and these men, every conversation recorded by hidden microphones, hidden in every potted plant and every light fitting in the rooms, in every tree where they went for a stroll, the transcripts survive somewhere, because I've seen three of them. One of them is numbered number 98, one of them is 170, and so on. So we know that there are hundreds of transcripts of those private conversations between Hess and his companions, and I'd like to see them. And they're not released into the archives.
Of course, I'd like to see that. Was the man in Spandau really Hess?
I think so. I know there's a controversy about this. Hugh Thomas has written a book about it. And I have to say, very clever to write an entire book on such an absurd thesis.
Yes, it's very interesting, because people love to think about things like that. But
I think he was, because I've got his handwriting throughout all the years.
Yeah.
It doesn't change. And you have to explain why another man would be willing to sit for 47 years in prison, 30 years in solitary confinement, if he wasn't the real Rudolf Hess.
It's hard to believe, isn't it?
But I do believe he was murdered. I find, along with the British authorities, I'm beginning to suspect that a 93-year-old man can't commit suicide. Not the way he was said. And the British acted so mysteriously when Hess died. In 6 successive days, there were six different versions as to how he had died, which implies straight away that something is being covered up here. And then they said, we found a suicide note. Well, I myself have in my files on Rudolf Hess half a dozen suicide notes, because he tried to kill himself on various occasions in British captivity, ramming a knife into his stomach, harakiri fashion, and jumping out of a first-floor balcony and this kind of thing. And each time he left a suicide note behind. And as he became more and more rambling and disorientated, he wrote lots of farewell notes to his family. And I think the British just took one of these and said, we have a farewell letter. And the one they published had no date on it. I think Hess was murdered. There's no question.
How interesting. Last April you were in Toronto and you gave evidence at Ernst Zundel's trial.
Yes.
Now,
he's the Canadian-American or German rather, who has been accused of spreading false information, which is, I believe, a common law offence and or medieval offence in Canada almost.
Well, it was called hate literature or something like that.
I think it's fortunate you don't have thumbscrews here, or the Iron Maiden. That's probably...
Well, I don't know. He sort of was accused of false information about the Holocaust or something. Now, you gave evidence at that trial.
Yes.
Does that mean to say you think he was right?
I was called by the defence to give evidence in this trial, and of course I hesitated.
Is that Christie?
by Doug Christie, the lawyer. And I'm ashamed to say that my first act, before I said, yes, I'll come, was to write a letter to the American government and a letter to the Canadian government asking them to guarantee that I would be allowed entry into Canada if I did come to give evidence. Because I had cause to believe that when I came to give evidence, I would be denied a visa to the United States. And I cannot afford to lose my visa to go to the United States, obviously. That would be professionally ruinous.
Yes.
And it wasn't until these two countries rather indignantly wrote me letters. In fact, the Canadian government rather cautiously didn't write me a letter. They telephoned an assurance to me that it was okay. And I said, very well, fellows, and I give it to me in writing. And then I came and gave evidence on the historical background of what is called the Holocaust. At the trial, I was shown remarkable evidence that had been assembled by the defense, which wasn't introduced in the court hearings because the judge ruled that it was not to be introduced. And this was an investigation that was carried out by the defense team of the Auschwitz site. And I must say that from that moment on, I've become a disbeliever, an unbeliever. I've joined a growing rank of what I can only describe as hardcore unbelievers. The investigation that Zundel carried out was he sent a number of experts over to Auschwitz with buckets and spades, and they chiseled away at the inside of the so-called gas chambers and removed 20 kilograms of mortar and cement and concrete and brought it back to the United States, where it was subjected to laboratory analysis. I have to say to myself, for 40 years, why hasn't anybody else thought of doing that? Because if there has been any kind of toxic gas used in those chambers, hydrogen cyanide, prussic acid, Cyclone B, whatever it was called, it will be in the cement. It will have seeped in. In fact, in the disinfectation chambers in Auschwitz, which were used for disinfecting the prisoners' clothing, killing off the lice and the vermin in the clothing because of the typhus plague, you can actually see the blue stain on the walls where the prussic acid of the cyanide has stained the wall. And the results showed quite conclusively that in those chambers, the disinfection chambers, there were extraordinary levels of cyanide content in the walls, even now, 45 years later. But in the so-called gas chambers, there's not the slightest trace.
Well, goodness gracious me. What about all these pictures we see of, you know,
It's baffling.
The Belsen and Auschwitz and things like that.
Well,
it's hard to dispute that.
You've got to draw a very clear distinction between the camps that we British and Americans liberated, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, in what is now West Germany, which nobody now claims were extermination camps or death camps. They were just very, very brutal prison camps. And the concentration camps, which are now said to have been the killing camps, the extermination camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka and Majdanek, Sobibor, which were all liberated by the Russians. And when we realize that, we begin to think to ourselves, wait a minute, well, we're not exactly going to believe what the Russians and the KGB tell us. And where do these photographs come from? And are those heaps of bodies really from Auschwitz, or perhaps after the air raid on Dresden that we mentioned earlier? This kind of thing. I can't go into that kind of dispute. All I know is that what I was shown at the Zundel trial in Toronto, and I've got a chemical background, I know it, and any chemists who are listening will know this, you can't fake chemical evidence. They couldn't have gone round those chambers inside scrubbing afterwards to get rid of the cyanide and the cement.
Well, what about the camps where the Americans and the British liberated? I mean, you see bulldozing.
Oh, there was a lot of dying.
Yes.
The typhus epidemic that swept the whole of Central Europe killed off millions of people, and many hundreds of thousands of people died in the prison camps because of the crowded insanity. Anne Frank, for example, we've all heard of Anna Frank.
Oh, yes, certainly.
She died of typhus. She died of typhus in the camp at Bergen-Belsen.
I see.
And she was one, I mean, tragic example of the typhus epidemic that swept the whole of Europe in 1944 and 1945, which is no surprise because we had bombed all the chemical factories, we had bombed the pharmaceutical factories. By 1945, there's no German factories supplying any more medicines. Epidemics were running rampant, and a lot of our own troops died as a result. In fact, I know specific cases where we supplied interpreters to work in Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald at the end of the war. In fact, a couple of women who went from the British Decoding Institute, Bletchley Park, the Ultra establishment, they went to Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen and they died of typhus. Good
gracious. So what you're trying to say then is that the bodies that were pushed into pits by bulldozers could have died from typhus, or...
Well, look at the photographs. They are not the bodies of healthy men at all. They're the terribly emaciated, living skeletons.
It's something I remember in all my life for those pictures, just terrible.
And it's in human nature. You see those photographs and your first instinct is to duck, you recoil, and you don't really look at them and you don't want to question. But the historian's job is to question.
Well, were you ever going to write a book about Auschwitz and the Holocaust?
Well, first of all, my opponents, or Zundel's opponents, have got to explain how it's possible to kill hundreds of people in gas chambers and not find any trace of cyanide in the walls. In 5 years down the road, I may write a book on the archaeology of Auschwitz. I'm already having the photographs of Auschwitz, the aerial photographs, reinterpreted by British experts. I'm going to repeat the chemical tests myself. Mm-hmm. It may very well be the last book I ever write.
But you still think you should do it as an historian?
Obviously, if you find something as big as this,
yeah.
A major, scandalous misinterpretation of history, and my own conclusion provisionally is that it derived from our own psychological warfare executive, that we ourselves started the story in the first place in 1942. We've got British records showing how the gas chamber story started on the British side. Obviously, if a historian finds this, he should really tell the world about it.
In other words, people are not disputing the Holocaust at all. They're disputing how it all happened, and
many hundreds of thousands of Jews and of course other people died most brutally during the Second World War. There's no question. And I think it's possibly unfortunate that Ernst Zundel is the person who's found this, because Ernst Zundel is both lovable and likable and intelligent and philosophical, but he's also obnoxious. He's a loudmouth. He's a self-publicist. Yeah. He's in deep trouble. He's the kind of person that people say, don't come near me, Ernst, you're bad news.
Yes.
But the fact remains that the chemical evidence cannot be denied. He's got it right this time.
Well, just to wind up, can we go back to the time when Churchill was always hoping that Britain would be bombed?
Oh, yes.
And I was fascinated in your book with how he went around every day saying, how can we make them bomb London?
Churchill needed the bombing of London to start because he was terrified that peace was going to break out in the summer of 1940.
Which it could have done, I understand.
Hitler had made a peace offer to the British, which the British never learned about. In fact, Rudolf Hess brought the details once more in May 1941. Mm-hmm. Hitler made a peace offer that was so magnanimous that the war would have stopped there and then had the British people ever heard of it. Basically, that Hitler would have pulled all his armies out of all the occupied countries except for the former German territories, and he just wanted our permission to invade Russia. And whereupon he would then have guaranteed the British Empire. He would have helped the British Empire if ever we got in trouble with the Japanese or the Italians or the Russians. And Churchill couldn't afford that to happen, not in the summer of 1940, because he had just come to power. If the war ended in June or July 1940, Churchill would have been finished. So he had to continue the war. So he started the bombing. He started bombing Berlin. He knew from the decoded German telegrams that Hitler had ordered the German Air Force never to bomb British towns, never to bomb. No bombing began. There was no bombing of London until September 1940.
I remember that because I lived in Croydon, or nearby Croydon, and the first thing I remember were bombs dropping. Yeah, I don't know when it was, 1940, I suppose, just bombing
Late summer 1940.
Yeah, I remember seeing them come out and wondered what it was, and then the Big Bang took place. But
this was because a few days previously, Churchill had started bombing Berlin in order to provoke the Germans deliberately to bombing London, his own capital. 7,000 Londoners died during the next month, and that was Churchill's fault. He deliberately provoked it.
So that he could stay in power.
Well, the British records reveal this without the slightest shadow of doubt.
Yeah, well, your book indicates that very much indeed. You're absolutely correct. Well, having lived through those days myself, I was slightly distraught when I find out these things. I thought to finish off the war as soon as possible would be the right thing and not have any bombing. Yeah. But anyway, I find this program, well, thank you for coming, of course, absolutely fantastic. And I do thank you for coming, and I hope that everybody will be interested in watching it, and will watch it more than once. Because I think what we've heard today is really something we should all know about, and I do recommend that you buy Churchill's War by David Irving, our guest today, the eminent British historian and author. Thank you very much for coming, David.
Thank you very much for questioning me.
Okay, that's great.